Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Resuming Debate podcast. I'm your host, MP Garnet Jenis. A few weeks after the last election, I got a call from our conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, inviting me to take on the employment portfolio as shadow minister, taking the lead on that. And it was a new thing for me, having spent a lot of the last 10 years as an MP working on issues in foreign policy, international development, human rights, those kinds of areas. So it was an exciting new challenge for me to take on this portfolio, and I was putting together a list of who are the people that I need to talk to really deepen my understanding of the portfolio, get up to speed, and hear good policy ideas. And Richard Diaz was one of the people at the top of that list that I was told you need to talk to this guy to help you develop your thoughts on the employment challenges facing our country. In particular, we're now in the midst of a full-blown jobs crisis. Richard is an economist. He works for IceCap Asset Management Limited, and he is a co-host of a very popular podcast called the Loonie Hour. So I've appreciated the chance to chat with him previously, and very happy that he's joining me on the podcast today. Richard, how are you today? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the warm welcome and the nice intro, and it's a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for the opportunity.
So, Richard, I want to talk mainly, and thanks for coming on. I want to talk mainly about jobs issues and some of the background factors that are causing the jobs crisis our country is facing, and hear your perspective on it. But jobs are, it seems to me, downstream from a lot of other things happening in the economy. So let's maybe start with, if you can give people an overview of how optimistic or pessimistic you are about the trajectory of the Canadian economy, how federal policy is shaping it, and what people need to know is the trajectory we're on at the moment.
Sure. Well, I think that Canada is on trend, and that trend is for more pain. Really, I mean, it's really hard to say it any other way. I mean, I might get some decent GDP prints here and there, but overall, I think what's important to understand is that we are in one of the biggest declines in standard of living that we've faced in really generations. I like to use GDP per capita as sort of a very broad, if flawed, way of measuring that. And we have been on a decline for 3 years, 12 quarters. But really, it's been flat for almost 6, and you could argue even almost 10 years. Really, we've had marginal increases, and not only compared to our own history, but compared to our OECD peers, which is an organization of rich countries, 37 of which Canada is behind, and the only country that we are ahead, 36. The only country we're ahead of is hardly a country at all, which is Luxembourg. That means from 2015 to now, basically, Canada is had the 37th worst GDP per capita growth, and that's really an indictment on, I would say, our industrial policy in Canada, our fiscal policy, certainly that's centered around that, and obviously related to industrial policy. And then, I think that the monetary policy lever bears some of the blame too. I just think we're going to get worse because that's often how cycles work. It's not a partisan thing. That's just when you start these economic or labor market cycles, you often reach a period of maximum pain before things get better. And I think, there's just no real light at the end of the tunnel yet. These things are always cyclical. And eventually things will turn around, as they often do. But yeah, from right now, I think things are going to get worse before they get better.
Okay, and you said a couple things there that I think might seem contradictory. I know that maybe they aren't, but they, like, on the one hand, that there's some government policy decisions that are leading us in this direction, but on the other hand, this is cyclical. So I guess some people, when they hear cyclical, they would think, well, there's just this inevitable cycle, and it's outside the control of policymakers. But on the other hand, you're pointing to failures of especially industrial and fiscal policy. So maybe to just kind of square that for those that are.
Yeah, sorry. I should have been more clear. I think we were in a structural decline that is a direct result of industrial and fiscal policy. That is unequivocal. I mean, virtually, whether compared to our peers and compared to our own history as Canadians, I think that's very obvious. What I meant by the cyclicality of it, I mean, we are having a rise in unemployment. And eventually, how people often say, the cure to high prices is high prices. Well, eventually you just can't, you can't fire everybody. I mean, eventually there is just a point in which there is a cleansing of the market. Now, how we get there, how fast we get that to that cleansing point, can we mitigate that decline? And then once we sort of are back on the ascendancy, what that looks like, that is a function of fiscal industrial policy. And my hope really is that we sort of change philosophy, change directions, change at the helm. I mean, I'd be lying if I told you otherwise. And so that's what I meant by, we just haven't had enough pain such that we change what we're doing.
Okay, so let's drill into those specific issues, those causes in a minute. But before that, you mentioned GDP per capita as being a broad but flawed important indicator. There's different indicators people hear reported on in terms of the health of the economy. There's like how the market's doing. There's GDP in total. There's GDP per capita. There's productivity numbers. For people that are kind of lay people wanting to know how the economy's doing, what indicators are best, which ones should they focus on, and what are the limitations of each indicator?
Sure. So, I mean, GDP growth is a good indicator. Again, despite the fact that it's flawed, and it's a good indicator because it's widely available, it's widely used, and it's easy to compare amongst your peers and over history. I think the mistake people do is often put too much emphasis on it as some kind of catch-all, and it's not. I mean, one obvious flaw is, when you think about consumption or expenditure or investment or net exports, the work that goes on unpaid, let's say at home, between your mothers and fathers and their children, would not be captured in this GDP figure. And of course, we know child rearing is obviously very, very important, or else our society will crumble and die. But do you know what I'm saying? So, like, just as an example, I think, and then often, you can get certain technical issues which muddy the water. So, for example, Ireland, which is used as a major tax avoidance or tax haven country because of the shenanigans they have with low corporate taxes and their presence / inclusion into the EU, sees their exports as a function of basically trade agreements and the corporate structures that these major tech companies have and abuse in order to enter the EU market, grossly inflates sort of the everyday improvements or otherwise of Irish citizens. So on the margins, there can be some issues that people bring up with GDP, but in general, it's a relatively good way. And again, it's a blunt force tool, but it's a decent way of looking at how an economy is doing. Another one is, for example, industrial production, or manufacturing. Obviously, different industries are important as well. So if you look at the retail sector or the wholesale sector, and then there's exports of particular goods and services. So, for example, energy is an extremely important part of Canadian economy, despite the best efforts of some people to destroy that sector. It's obviously very important, and how well that specific industry is doing is something that we look at. And then there's obviously the other side of things, which is things like unemployment or employment rates, and then more ephemeral but very important indicators like productivity growth. They're something that we as economists and investors pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah. Okay. So the top line GDP per capita number is easier to follow, has some technical problems, but generally pretty good. And you're looking at some of the other factors as well that you mentioned.
Yeah,
In terms
we
of
look at everything. I mean, GDP per capita. Oh, sorry. Just one more thing on GDP
yeah,
per capita. I mean, that for basically it's only been politicized in Canada recently because it's going so badly,
mm-hmm.
and the people in charge are desperate to distract from what has been a successive, basically bad policy decisions. I mean, that's it. I mean, when I was in university 20 years ago, GDP per capita was just understood to be the way one looks at standard of living across country over time, etc. Nobody was under the impression that looking at GDP per capita was some kind of perfect indicator of wealth and health of your economy and society. Nobody was under that impression. However, if you showed one country A where GDP per capita was going up in a steady, consistent fashion, and country B where GDP per capita was going down in a steady, consistent fashion, the alarm bells were clear, and the emphasis on where the sort of problems would clearly be in country B. I mean, that would be something that we would sort of highlight, and it would be an issue, and it would be, there would be obviously some investigation needed. And so the fact that it's become politicized over the last few years in Canada is actually a real shame, because that is how we can judge the merits of our leaders, their decisions, and how it's doing well or not.
In terms of kind of the whole question of the health of the economy overall, the comments of the parliamentary budget officer have been in the news recently. Curious for your reaction to what he's had to say, and if you agree with his take or not, or partially.
I mean, there's a couple of things. First of all, I applaud him for his bravery. He will clearly not get the top job going forward, so he really, took a real hit. There's no way that the current government will reward somebody for their honesty and their forthrightness. So I really admire him for coming out and saying that. I think it's also really important that I am of the belief that there's loads of people in government who genuinely just care about getting the numbers right.
Yeah.
And they take their independence very, very, very seriously. And when a person in that role, whether it be an auditor general or a central banker, or in this case, a parliamentary budget officer, uses language as strong as stupefying or unsustainable, I think it behooves us as citizens and analysts and MPs to take that stuff extremely, extremely serious. Now, whether or not I think I think that Canada's been on the wrong path fiscally for a while. I think, and he's demonstrated that, I think, in very obvious and straightforward numbers. And I don't think he, and I think, like I said, it takes a lot of bravery, because I think the easy thing to do would have been to say everything's just fine, please give me the next job give me the top job. Remember, he's an interim leader.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is also really important is that his forecast, like these people, and I say these people, I mean, so for example, in the United States, they have a congressional budget officer, and the EU, they have a similar situation. And in Canada, we have the PBO, which is actually based off of the CBO in the United States. But they never forecast recessions, and nor do I think they should. So if you look at the numbers that he's plotted out, and then where those numbers are sort of based off of, it's actually a benign economic growth outlook. And the real issue I have with his numbers are if things aren't as good as they have sort of laid out as their base case. And because if they aren't, that means all the deficit numbers that we've sort of been introduced to that all are already unsustainable will get much worse, which is just a function of math, right? If you have, it's just really straightforward. Revenues versus expenses. If your revenues, e.g. tax dollars, fall and your expenses stay very high, that just means your deficit's going to explode already from an already high number. And so that's the part that I think was touched on in the committee meeting. But I think rightly, the PBO, does not forecast sort of recessions. They just sort of outline what they think is going to happen given the current sort of benign outlook.
Right. Okay. So yeah, and I appreciate that you kind of integrated the explanation of this office. Like, it's an important office of being able to provide nonpartisan fiscal information and advice to parliamentarians. That person is supposed to have the job security of being able to speak with authenticity. The government has creatively set things up so that the current parliamentary budget officer does not have that security, and yet he's speaking very bluntly in spite of that lack of kind of position security, which is an added reason why we should take the problems he's flagging very seriously. Now, I mean, the counter argument we're going to hear right away from people is saying, isn't this all just the result of Donald Trump and tariffs? So can you parse out kind of what the impacts are of tariffs versus what are the impacts of what you described earlier as kind of macro policy failure around industrial and fiscal policy decision making?
Yeah, so I think that that's a real easy cop out, but I think what's important as a starting point, what's important to note is that Canada's structural issues, lack of productivity growth, lack of investment, a poor labor mix, a horrific immigration policy, lack of R&D investment, public sector employment that's far too high, a federal tax take that's at the 30-year high relative to GDP. I mean, the list goes on and on. Started far before January 2025 when Donald Trump took office. It's just all of that is a factual statement. Happy to demonstrate and show the charts and data that support that view. What's also really important is before Donald Trump was even elected, in March of 2024, remember the U.S. election was November of 2024, and Donald Trump took office in January of 2025. So in March of 2024, another, in my view, independent, sage, and committed, government worker, Carolyn Rogers, the deputy governor of the Bank of Canada, basically published a speech declaring that Canada's productivity growth was in a state of emergency. She literally, I always forget the title of the speech, but it was something along the lines of break glass. And she literally alludes to that, alludes to in times of emergency, you need to break glass. And it was basically a warning that Canada has been going down the wrong path for some time, and that a change in philosophy needed to happen, or else things would get a lot worse. And so, although I do concede that Donald Trump putting on tariffs has hurt and may continue to hurt, I think that we were already in a state of extreme weakness, as demonstrated a numerous indicator. I mean, unemployment rate had already gone up significantly, right? The labor participation rates in Canada were already falling. Employment ratios were already at 20-year lows. And then obviously he piles on, which I don't necessarily approve of, obviously. But that's really, really important in the context of where we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, the tariff policy has had negative effects on Canada. Clearly, I would argue it's had negative effects on the United States as well. It has created the conditions in which some political actors can partway along a trend say, "Aha, this is the cause," and it's. I think it's a disprovable claim, but it's as people see the increase of pain in their lives as a result of bad economic decision making, it does provide the people that have been in power for the last 10 years somewhere to point that isn't them, and it does kind of obscure the accountability conversation.
100%. I would contest that the tariffs are necessarily bad for America. I mean, first of all, I'm as a small L liberal, I believe that countries should not necessarily tariff each other. But Canada has enormous tariffs with other countries, and the other thing that often we forget about is there's things like non-tariff trade barriers. Also, Canada has huge amounts of tariffs within province, something that was articulated extremely well in a 2019 IMF paper, which we seem to be totally content with. And so, yeah, and there's other countries like the EU is somehow they play themselves up as this, great free trading agreement. What the EU is free trade within the EU, but there are staunch defenders for people who are on the outside of this club, right? And so I just think it's important. There's loads and loads of research to demonstrate that as before Donald Trump, got the bee in his bonnet, that the U.S. had the lowest trade and non-tariff trade barriers with any other major country in the world by a long way. And so I just think it's a little ironic that everybody hates tariffs when the U.S. does it, but it's totally fine when they do it. So that's the first thing. And so the other thing about what's important to note also is that, I think that one of the worst things that's happened right now is the insistence to pivot away from America, besides being a complete fantasy, is that it's precluding Canada from creating a deal with America. And I would argue, and I would submit that any deal is better than no deal. And because I think that ultimately, if you have some kind of deal, even though if it's perceived as bad in the near term, you have at least some certainty as to the rules that you are playing as a businessman or woman trying to sell goods and services abroad. And that once you have any deal in place, such that the rules don't change from that point onward, you can then adjust your business around those set of rules. But having no deal is in an uncertainty that causes all kinds of problems, because it's just natural. It's almost like it's effectively game theory. You want to wait until you're told what the rules of the game are, and before you then continue. And the stupid example is just in football. If you don't know that you can go for, if you're like, I like NFL football, if you don't know what the rules are, then you can't throw a Hail Mary or what have you, or you can't run the ball or whatever it is. And so, but once you know that the rules, even if they may or may not be advantageous to you or disadvantageous to you, then you can at least adjust your business. That's not to say that you wouldn't have pain, but at least you could go forward with some kind of investment, hiring practice, whatever it is, marketing scheme, whatever, what have you. And so the fact that there has been no trade deal yet, I would argue, is a significant contributor to the economic weakness that we're facing in Canada.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, especially in the context where Mark Carney had really set clear expectations around a timeline for a trade deal, and those expectations clearly haven't been met. Like he's made some commitments around what would happen that haven't been borne out. I had a roundtable in my constituency a couple of weeks ago on Canada-U.S. relations specifically, and I was struck by the fact that, as it happened, the folks who came kind of were across a certain spectrum in terms of their opinion about the American administration in general, but everybody was kind of sick of Canadian politics being sort of captured by a constant watching and waiting for what he's going to do. And they wanted to see us, you mentioned internal trade barriers. They wanted to see us doing the things that we can do and controlling the things we can control and focusing on improving our own economy. I think we can do multiple things at once, but I see that as being something that the Canadian people want, is us to like have a conversation about what are the things we can control, controlling those things to make our economy stronger, and bluntly facing up to some of these structural weaknesses that you've talked about.
Well, that's what's so frustrating for me. It's like, they were just given I think in life it's better to be lucky than good. And I think what aggravates me as someone who's sort of I'm a patriot. I love Canada. It's given my family and me everything I could ever want. I really want what's best for this country and for the working class people in particular, who basically have gotten screwed over the last, 15, 20 years because of consistent failures from our political class on both sides of the aisle, if I may say. And I think that, to just basically been given sort of a get out of jail free card for the consistently bad decisions drives me totally crazy, because, a silly example is like the anti-oil rhetoric that we consistently are told. I mean, I'll never, ever forgive the previous administration for saying that there's no business case for natural gas when our allies and NATO allies, so much rhetoric about protecting NATO and saving NATO, when literally our allies from NATO came begging cap in hand for the ample natural resources that Canada has. Of course, they would rather buy it from Canada. We're a stable liberal democracy that's not trying to kill them. And so Germany, and we denied them that, and that to me is putting political ideology in front of pragmatism and the well-being of Canadians. And so that's something I find, I don't think I'll ever really forgive that person for doing that. But Canada can do so much, and in a weird, and people might not like this, but in a weird, screwed up way, I think Donald Trump might be sort of the best thing that ever happened to us, because he's, although some part of our political class is using him as a cover for all their shitty decisions, there's another element to that, which is he's exposing sort of the inherent weakness in those crappy decisions, and the fact that we do need to pivot away from the dogma and the ideology that's largely as a result of all this bad investment. And so in a screwed up way, I think, that medicine is something that Canadians needed to have. I think it was going to come eventually, and he sort of just brought it forward.
The That's interesting. I mean, the major projects. I mean, I think there are Canadians who now like they see the need for us to move forward with our own development because of that pressure. Um, but I do think the obscuring of accountability is a big problem that is making it harder at the same time to point out, hey, these are some policies that aren't working. Let's kind of, it's kind of the natural place to move from here is to talk about the jobs numbers
Sure.
that we're seeing. Um, jobs numbers can indicate some specific things happening as it relates to jobs. They can also be downstream from other problems. In speaking about the jobs numbers, I've drawn attention to the government's anti-energy, for instance, as one contributing factor to these problems. Bill C-69, which makes development projects in general harder to undertake. What do you see as the factors contributing to the job numbers we're facing right now, and how would you contextualize them in terms of kind of how bad, getting worse, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, like Canada's unemployment rate is rising because our economy is not productive, and that's those are related. We the other thing is that then so productivity is sort of an ephemeral thing that's people hard to calculate, hard to understand, hard to conceptualize, and but ultimately it's if you we've been in a situation where another way to think about GDP is like, and this is where you start first principles. Another way of thinking about GDP is you have population, the number of people that are growing or whatever or shrinking, and then you have how productive each individual is, not how hard they work, because there's loads of hardworking people out there, but how productive. And so you times one by the other and you sort of get your GDP. And what Canada has done, unfortunately, is we've started with we went from an immigration system that was the envy of the world, where we imported high wage, highly productive individuals to come contribute to Canada. And we shifted away from that model to low skilled, low wage laborers who were just simply not productive, not in the way that we understand it, and certainly not relative to history. Now, people don't like to hear that, but it's not my job to make people feel good. It's about my job is to reflect and articulate the literal data that's going on. And you can see this. So our productivity growth has basically been zero for the last 10 years, which is incredible. And yet top line growth is rising. And why? And it's because basically we've just imported literally millions of warm bodies. Now that can work for a time, but ultimately what you need is productivity. But the problem is you need productivity to then flow from to improve sort of the capacity for your economy. And what we've seen is over the last little while, we've come to sort of a head. We've reached the sort of the limits on which adding warm bodies can contribute to our economy in a sort of a sustainable way. And two ways that I can demonstrate that is the employment to population growth is now at a 20-year high. So we're literally importing people literally en masse. So I think from January 2023 to now, there's been 2.2 million people who've entered Canada's economy, and there's only been about 500,000 private sector jobs. That's an incredible misstep on the part of our immigration policy, the likes of which will take 10 or 15 years probably to wash out. And the reason that's important is because if you're inviting people to come here who are productive or more productive than the incumbents, what those people do is they create it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You create new jobs, new industries. Those industries that are existing become a situation where they're hiring more employees, and that sort of flywheel can accelerate, and it becomes a virtuous circle. And the opposite's true. If you're importing people who aren't working, who aren't adding, or let's say they're going to go work in the public sector, that public sector is important, but get it. But we're now sort of at an extreme 30-year high in public sector employment. You have a situation where there are fewer and fewer people who are actually paying taxes or building businesses or sort of quote unquote contributing to the economy. And then add on, so that's a structural framework in which I'm looking at it. And then there's a cyclical framework, which I'm looking at it, which is, you just have situations where you've reached sort of the limit of some kind of endogenous cycle. And you have a situation where you just have higher and higher unemployment until there's some kind of cleansing. And that's what I think Canada is lacking. We're lacking of a cleansing in the housing market. We're certainly lacking a cleansing in the public sector. And so what we're seeing, we are now starting to see sort of a cleansing in that market. People don't like to think about things like that, but that's really what we need. There's been a lot of misallocation of capital, as well as misallocation of labor. And that's the thing for as far as like the employment per se. I mean, where it really starts to bite is when those people are starting to basically can't find work, and that's what we're seeing. I mean, and yeah, sorry, I don't know if maybe I lost the plot a little bit, but does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one comment is that like what you're describing really underlines the importance of measuring the right indicators, because it seems to me that the government has talked about kind of GDP overall as being a guiding light for them, but if you have a significant increase in population, probably that's going to lead to some modest increase in GDP for a period of time. But if your GDP per capita is flatlining or going down, then each individual is not getting wealthier. They may be getting less wealthy, and you're simply kind of effectively you're creating the conditions in which the total number goes up because the number of people's going up, but you're not increasing the actual productivity of each worker. So productivity is a measure of what an individual produces. And I think it's important clarification. You said it's not about how hard working somebody is. Somebody could be working very hard with limited tools, and they're going to be less productive in terms of output than somebody who is working less hard with more tools. But how wealthy we are is a function of how much on a per person basis we're able to produce. So if you had a country with 10 times as many people that was producing 5 times as much, the GDP would be higher, but we would as individuals be poorer.
Right.
And so this is where hitting the right indicator is so important.
The other thing that's really important to note is that you can't distribute wealth that you don't create. And I think the problem that I think a lot of people, the problem I get into is like when we learn about wealth in your economics class, it's not like cash money, you know what I mean? To buy like to like go buy clothes. Wealth is sort of, it includes the stock of capital. It's like, it is about how much. So wealth is more it's my job as an economist to think of a new word so it doesn't get sort of conflated with like riches. Do you know what I mean? I mean, from like an economic perspective, you want people wealthier, meaning they have more resources to consume, and resources, again, not chocolate bars or diamonds. I mean, resources as in like tax revenue that you can then distribute, or tax revenue that you can invest in hospitals and roads, etc. That's what or like capital stock that you can, if you attach capital stock with a strong and educated labor market, and then you get a productive laborer who then can generate extra output that you can then distribute to the less fortunate in our society. That's what I mean by wealth in inverted commas, not money, not to buy like a mansion somewhere, you know what I mean? So that's what I think that's what we mean by that. And I think, but back to the employment numbers, where we're going, why it's going to be difficult. Like, people need to come to terms with the fact that unless there's a wholesale change in the philosophy around industrial policy in our country, and to a degree and on the margins, I think it would be disingenuous to say that there hasn't been a change. There has been a change. Whether it's the right one, whether it's enough, that's maybe a conversation for a different day. But I think that may be too late, in the sense that often when you get these sort of big jumps in unemployment, you need sort of a proper recession in order to really clear things out. You're going to have some declining GDP growth. That means the top line growth might have a couple of really bad quarters. Unemployment might really spike. And the reason that's important from a cyclical perspective is that you have that cleansing, and that cleansing allows an economy to sort of reset and find its footing again at a lower price level to then sort of restart, if that makes any sense. Yeah. I know no one wants to hear that, but that's the way these things go, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to drill into your comments on the sort of cleansing issue. So, if I understand right, there's problems in terms of a lot of policy decision making, and the cleansing. It's kind of the equivalent of hitting rock bottom, is what you're talking
Yeah.
about. Like, it's the point at which it's like, okay, this is bad. We can't go on like this. We have to fix problems that we've put off. And so, like, ideally, you would fix those problems before you hit that rock bottom point. But it's the point at which changes have to happen. And if you can't persuade people to support energy development, fix immigration, make control spending, if you can't convince people to make those policy changes before you hit that critical point, then you kind of have to do it all at once when you hit that critical point. Is that sort of what you mean by cleansing? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's more or less what I'm trying to say. I think yeah, I mean, the other thing is, like, there's also just a natural attrition of markets. I mean, I'm a free market economist, I believe that, I believe that centrally planned economies are not the right way to do things. Here's like an example, right? Like, there's a lot of hand wringing around Canada Post. And I understand there's thousands, tens of thousands of people who work for Canada Post. And, you don't want good people to lose their jobs. But nobody sends mail anymore. Like, I send postcards whenever I travel, but other than
I send a lot of
don't
mail to
check.
my constituents. It's
But that,
but
come on, let's
clearly
everybody
it's not.
listening to.
Clearly, it's not used the same way it was in the past, right?
Thank you. Like
Clearly, it's changing.
90%, like email exists. There's been a structural change in the way that human beings on planet Earth use the post office. And to insist that we treat mail the same way it was treated in 1980s or 90s or even the 2000s is that you are disassociated from the reality on the ground. And in order, so you can do two things. You can either A, admit an uncomfortable truth, fire tens of thousands of people, reposition, readjust in my view, mail is still an important part of our societal infrastructure, but it needs to be clearly scaled down and adjusted and rotated and pivoted to a new paradigm. Or you can put bad money after good. You can basically waste a limited amount of resources we have as a society to keep what is ultimately a fiction continuing to turn over. And ultimately, inevitably, the fiction will end. Maybe not in this cycle, maybe not in tomorrow's cycle. The fiction of we need post every single day will end because people are not going to start moving towards more mail. They will move towards less mail. That's an endogenous factor outside of any political machinations that might exist. And so, but the question we have as politicians or as people who think about these things is, how much money do you want to waste before a objective reality asserts itself in such a way that not even the most ardent supporters of mail can support it? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, nobody.
Yeah, like we could have a long conversation about the mail issue specifically, but I mean,
I'm just
think
using
that,
it as that as an example.
yeah,
Like,
exactly. The underlying point is that, like, there are changes that happen driven by technology, by exogenous
right.
events, and like try to respond to those in ways that recognize the change, or you don't. And if you ignore the change, then well, probably you're saying probably you're going to be forced to deal with that. It's just a question of whether you deal with it earlier or later, and there's more pain involved if you deal with it later.
Right. I'm not trying to pick on that specific subject. To be honest, I don't really know the full thing, but like,
I get
like,
the underlying point.
Come on,
Yeah,
like,
totally.
my submission to the, it's like, what are we talking about here? Nobody sends mail, and we're trying to put, like, and so instead of just having an honest, and to a degree, I think the current administration is doing that, and Mr. Lightfoot, who is something I have a lot of respect for, he, or I can't remember his name. Anyway, the gentleman who's basically at the head of this is basically said, like, it's not happening. But my point is that you don't have to wait until the 11th hour in order
Mail is a good example of an area where just for a long time the government didn't want to talk about it, right? Like they didn't
right.
approve Canada Post's corporate plan. There was like okay, we're gonna after 2015 is like we're gonna freeze things where they are, and then like it was not that they had a plan to do something different. It's that they just didn't want to do anything at all. But
let me give you a
yeah.
better example. So like we shouldn't like there should have in the 1860s. Before Canada was even really a proper country, the U.S. was threatening the sovereignty of what was just like a figment in a couple of British colonialists' imagination, which is this idea of Canada. And the way that Canada was stitched together was via this Canadian Pacific Railway. And in a real sense, that railway stitched what was 2 or 3 disparate colonies into one whole thing. Right or wrong, that's what happened. And it's annoying to me that we had to wait again for some kind of external threat to do what should have been very obvious, barring the ideological capture of certain politicians. E.g., a suite of pipelines, not just one, tons of them from west to east to stitch Canada together from an energy perspective, very much echoing what happened in the 1860s and 70s. So, for example, the southern part of Ontario gets virtually all of its refined oil products, gasoline, diesel, kerosene, whatever, natural gas, from America. That's insane. We should be getting it from Alberta. We should be, and the reason we get it from the United States is because the pipelines go south and then across underneath the Great Lakes and then back up into Ontario, the largest and most important economic part of Canada. So no sensible country in the world would allow their most important economic hub to be virtually at the mercy of a foreign country. Foe or friend, irrelevant. We should have long ago thought, hey, sovereignty is important to Canadians. Energy security is obviously very important to Canadians. Oil and gas not going anywhere. Let's make sure that we have some sort of, not backup plan, but, some kind of resiliency such that if our, neighbor ever gets a little ornery, we have some kind of backup. And then lo and behold, some guy gets elected. He does some mean tweets. And now all of a sudden we're thinking about something we should have done years ago, and again, this is not Monday morning quarterbacking. People have been talking about this for years and years and years and years. And so it's fascinating. And so to me, it's the same kind of thing. And there will be a pipeline that goes across Canada. It is an inevitability because we cannot allow our energy security be dictated by a country, despite the fact that they're our best friend and ally. That is bad country policy. And so it's either we get on the front foot and do it under our terms at our, when we want to do it, or be forced to do something. But the inevitability of that pipeline across, and I don't mean just one pipeline. I mean, it should be all things, crude oil, natural gas, everything. It will happen. And so it's how you want to be. And I think, so that to me is just like another real-time example of what's been going on.
Yeah. I remember I had a quip after 2016 where I would say I don't really know what the trajectory of American politics is going to be, but I know that no president is going to be elected on the slogan "Make Canada Happy Again." Like the trajectory of more protection is there, and that means we need to defend our interests. Excuse me. Can we drill more into the immigration points you made? And I think it's really good to be able to talk to an economist about immigration because it's difficult to have a conversation about immigration. It has been difficult, I think, in a way that recognizes that there are natural limits to what is realistic, that you have to have a prudent immigration policy that acknowledges the benefits of immigration and also talks about kind of prudence and capacity. How do you think we can have a better, more thoughtful conversation on immigration that draws on economic data and looks at our national interest in a clear-sighted way?
I mean, I'm annoyed that I've had to qualify all of my arguments. I mean, I am the son of penniless immigrants to Canada. My parents came here with nothing. They lived the immigrant dream. My mom is as ardent Canadian, as patriotic as anyone that you've ever met. My father, God rest his soul, was this exact same way. Immigration is important and helpful to a country that's ultimately quite empty. If we're being honest about it, the problem, as I've mentioned many times, is the dose makes the poison. And for basically from 1980 to 2015, our population growth, which includes deaths, births, immigration, emigration, I always get those ones confused, in and out, was about 320,000 people per year. In 2015 and 16, and then again in 19, the rules were changed. And it tripled Canada's population growth within just a couple of years, so that we were at a run rate of something like almost 1 million people a year, 95 point whatever percent of which were from outside. That is not responsible policy. It's certainly not responsible immigration policy. And I think it's the worst thing that they could have ever have done was break the consensus and sour the sentiment people have towards immigration. So now, if you ask people, do they think immigration is important to Canada? Overwhelming majority of people say no. And if my father was alive, that would break his heart, just like it breaks my heart, because we've gone from something that is basically a non-issue from both sides of the aisle. No one would have been taken seriously in 2015 saying we need to cut immigration. The most ardent far-right person, left, doesn't matter. Now, it's a consensus we need to effectively end it. And that is, to me, the real tragedy of this whole thing. That's the sort of the emotional piece. The numbers bit really, really matters because from a couple of things. Number one, from a working class perspective, what we did was we changed the rules of the game such that instead of being specific to high wage, high skilled immigration, we went down the wage and skill scale. And what that did was it directly affected incumbents in Canada who were not highly skilled and highly paid. Very straightforward, supply and demand. If you increase supply of something and demand is relatively stable, you lower the price. The price being, in this case, wages. The other thing is that immigrants generally who are renters and not buyers. And so you have a situation where, and what do working class people do? They rent, they don't buy. And so you put an acute amount of pressure on the people in society who could handle it the least, working class people who are low education, low skilled labor. And you basically said to those people, you're now going to compete for renting your home, which is obviously a limited resource, right? You can't build a new apartment block in a weekend or a year. Sometimes it takes 2 years. But we're going to import loads and loads of people to compete for, not only are you going to compete for wage growth, but you're also going to compete for where you're living. And then the worst outcome of that is that these people, because they're low skilled and low wage, there's two other factors that affect productivity directly. One is they're literally not that productive because that you have to become higher skilled and then, go to school, whatever. So it takes just some time literally to then become skilled. I'm not saying that some of these people won't eventually be high productive workers, but almost by definition, they were not. And the second thing is you do a labor substitution effect. So instead of a company who was otherwise going to have to invest CapEx into new processes to deal with higher wage pressures or to train workforce to retain what was otherwise a scarce labor force, they just said, oh, we have an out. So instead of training new people or investing into new processes to improve labor productivity, we're just going to absorb this new labor supply and do nothing else on the CapEx front, which is exactly what happened. And don't take my word for it. I mean, there's like loads of papers that theorize that this would happen, and then to watch it in real time is crazy. And so now we're in a situation. And so that's just pure. That's as like dispassionate as I could possibly be about a subject. But we basically ran a real world experiment. And of course, what's so screwed up is that if you're an asset holder, if you're wealthy, if you're upper middle class, if you're old, none of these policies affected you. If you're a baby boomer and you already have your house paid for, or you live in Toronto, or like none of this impacts you whatsoever. But if you're young, you're working class, you're uneducated, you just had, now you went from, you were about to be in the ascendance. You were about to be a scarce commodity, a scarce resource on which people were going to bid on your services. Meaning the wages would have to climb necessarily, to being basically flooded with competition that you didn't vote for, and that's certainly not going to help your life prospects. So the whole thing is just fascinating, really fundamentally fascinating, that, sorry to say, but that a left-wing party took this, this angle. And like, Bernie Sanders was right. I mean, in 2014, he was interviewed about open borders, unfettered immigration, and he argued it was a right-wing Koch brothers conspiracy to devalue the labor market. This is what Bernie Sanders, the arch left-wing, he's the grand poobah of like left-wing economic and labor market thinking in the United States from political perspective. I mean, not academically. Yeah. And he said it was a bad idea because of how it would affect the people in the labor market. And they did that. They did the thing that Bernie Sanders rejected full scale in 2014. And it's fascinating to now watch this happen. So we saw it in the rental growth tracked population growth. Obviously, there was papers in July of 2024, the monetary policy report of the Bank of Canada outlined clearly, clear as day, what happens to wages and rents when you have an influx of low skill, low wage migrants. And it's hurt our productivity growth for the reasons I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really fascinating analysis. I think if you talk to sort of employers in different regions and in different kinds of businesses, you'd hear different kinds of feedback on that. They would argue that in some cases, not having access to that pool of labor leads people to go out of business. So it's not that they'll pay more or invest in training; they'll just go out of business. What would be your response to that? To that comment?
If your business can't run because you can't import cheap labor, then you need to. Then there's something wrong with your business. This is the thing. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't want free market when it suits you, and then when it doesn't suit you, complain that you don't have cheap labor. I mean, that's just. I fundamentally don't agree with that. I mean, there are certain seasonal industries that this unequivocally works. Whereas, for example, agriculture, you need to import because it's hyper seasonal, and you literally just need warm bodies to do low skilled, low wage labor. Mm-hmm. There's other examples where there's other industries where you want the highest skilled possible person. You know what I mean? You want, if you don't have a nuclear physicist to run a nuclear power plant in Ontario somewhere, you're bringing in that high skilled person to meet a specific skills gap. But that's not what happened. We had a situation where, that's the point. You can't. The idea that you can't run a business because you can't basically subvert the labor market. And that's your argument. Your argument is, well, if we can't subvert the labor market, then no, that means that business should go out of, you know what I mean? You have to allow the market to sort of.
Yeah. So, and the other thing I hear is sort of questions around labor mobility and also skills training, right? Actually, I'm at this point, given the state of the economy, in larger centers, employers looking for entry level jobs, they're not dealing with a shortage of applications at all. It's either employers in very kind of remote areas where they're kind of pessimistic about whether they could attract those unemployed people from urban centers who would maybe face sort of challenges relocating. But then a lot of it's employers saying there being skill challenges, a gap between kind of looking for specific skills. And I guess there's got to be some role for employers in providing training with those skills. But what do you see as the issues around kind of geography gaps or skill gaps when it comes to
that's not what we did. That's right.
Not what we did. Yeah. I'm not defending the government's policy.
No. But
I agree with you. But
you make a really good point, which is like if you're in the middle of nowhere and you need some warm body to fill a role and no one wants to do that, and you raise the wage, and if no one, and to the point where your business can't run, then fine. And then you say, okay, fine, then. But that's not at all what we did. That wasn't even what was proposed, right? So like that, to me, that's like that's like retrospectively you're saying, if that wasn't the case, you didn't say I'm going to get this immigrant to come to Canada to then go in the middle of nowhere and run a company run.
This comes back to your
employed
original
there.
point that they broke the system, right? Like
They broke
failed
the
to
system.
manage
There
it,
was no
and
rhyme or reason, because I can guarantee you, if like there was no rhyme or reason. It just wasn't. And like what's really, really important to note about this is there was some, like, I'm a tourist when it comes to labor market economics. Okay. Like I know quite a bit, sure. But ultimately, if I'm honest, I'm a tourist. There are people who've committed their entire lives academically who've spoken about this at length. Professor Michael Scuderud, who's like a university professor at Waterloo, who gave testimony in 2014 rejecting 2015 or whatever it was, rejecting this new angle of approach for the exact reasons that I've laid out. It was well identified that this was the wrong way to go about this. And the other thing that's really important is, again, so that's the part. I think, but as far as labor mobility, I think that's something that the government can do, I think, in a really interesting way, which is to grease the wheels of market signals. So that's, if I was the king of Canada, one of the things I would say is like, okay, here's a humongous tax break for moving. So one of the big things that I think that Canada doesn't do enough is encourage moving. So let's say if I'm in Montreal, I can't find a job in Montreal, but there's a job in Trois-Rivières. Moving is expensive. And people often, given the situation that we're in right now, is often people don't have an extra $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 kicking around to get a moving truck. And let's be honest, you're not going to pack up yourself. You're going to have to pay a company to come pack all your kitchenware while you're like, people have jobs and like they have to take childcare. So
you have to send stuff in the
way,
mail so much more, right?
Yeah, well, that's it. You know what I mean? One of the things that I would do if I was like the king of Canada would be like, you get up to a $10,000 tax break for moving. So if you spend $5,000 on moving, like literally, I mean, hopefully the market forces don't increase the price of moving, but let's just say in a perfect world, you have a situation where, you hire a moving company, they charge you $3,000 to move your stuff 500 kilometers down the road. That's a tax break. And so that would be like, and then so somebody who is offered a job, that's an extra 5 or 10 or 15 grand in a different disparate society or city, they now all of a sudden they feel like that the barrier to the entry has been lowered for them. And so to me, all you're doing is allowing market forces to more easily move. There'd be less friction in that market force. And so that to me is something I would consider, and that would allow labor to sort of more acutely and quickly find where it's demanded, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting proposal, and in any event, right? Like we can't just keep thinking of immigration as the solution to these problems, because it brings, as you say, all kinds of other attendant problems. Like so it's good to hear sort of proposals like that. Richard, we're up against time a little bit. Thank you for being so generous with yours, but I want to throw in one more concept into this discussion of kind of the state of the Canadian economy and issues around labor, and that is the impact of AI.
Sure.
AI can make the individual worker substantially more productive. It also is bringing to the fore concerns about job loss as a result of technological improvement. So, how do you see the impact of AI on the Canadian economy and on the labor force?
I mean, I don't know. I think that there's different ways to think about it. I haven't really figured out how I really view it. I think that there's like, there's the way I like to frame it is there's Wall-E and there's Terminator. And so Wall-E, if you guys aren't familiar, is a Pixar film where all the AI are these little mini robots that basically do all the jobs that humans don't want to do. And in this case, it'd be trash collection. So a little Wall-E drives around and he cleans up after humans, and then the humans basically can stop doing those super low, undesirable jobs because they're done by, by these little cute little robot with googly eyes. And then there's the sort of the other end of that spectrum, which is Terminator. And if you're not familiar with the plot of Terminator, AI basically became sentient. It was through Skynet, and then it co-opted basically a military industrial complex and then crushed humanity by basically making a surplus to requirements at all levels, not at the low end. And I think that probably the answer is in between those two extremes. I don't think we'll have like a sentient being that will just wipe us off the face of the earth. Although, be careful what you say. But I think that the reality is that the nature of that low skill thing will change. I think that there will be jobs that are done by AI that will just supplant loads of different roles in society. I think. And so that's the way I think it'll be a mixed bag. I think that people, like, for example, there'll be an extreme amount of pressure on, let's say, some types of lawyer and legal practices as an example. However, we're a long way from replacing, childcare or taking after old people, which is like technically relatively low skilled. I mean, relative to like brain surgery or whatever, you know what I mean? Obviously important, vital to a society, but relatively low skill, relatively low wage. Whereas I think that there are some other parts, but for example, radiology, right? So where it's looking at scans, whether X-rays and MRIs, and identifying potential cancers, that job is getting wiped out. That within 10 years from now, you will not meet a person who does radiology, save being the rubber stamp of the AI that figures that out, because it's like basically it's just basically identifying a picture, comparing it to previous pictures, and then do you have cancer, yes or no? And it's incredible the degree to which that specific role in that specific industry is under immense pressure. Because why would you pay somebody $250,000 to identify whether or not this is a tumor or not, when you can literally have a computer do it in 0 point faster and more accurately for no money?
Yeah, just as you're talking about it, it's interesting to think about this. What constitutes this distinction between high skill and low skill? Because there are some jobs. There are some jobs that clearly require a human, and yet are not technically complex. And there are other tasks that we would have generally identified as high skill that are nonetheless exclusively of a technical nature.
Yeah, I think the mistake we make is often thinking of things as like some homogeneous blob and we don't give enough allow for the granularity. So that's like one sec. The other thing I think that's really important is like in the 1800s, if you've ever heard the expression somebody is a Luddite. And so a Luddite is somebody who's sort of antithetical to, or they're anti-technology and they're worried about not only are they anti, but they actively fight against technology. And so what it was basically the invention of sort of steam engines and their use in agricultural, production and whatever. And so, they were basically a group of people who rioted, violently so in some cases, to sort of protest and sort of attack the use of energy and labor saving technology in the 1800s. I can't remember exactly what year. And so now that's when we call someone who doesn't want to use in the internet, call them a Luddite or whatever. And I think that what people misunderstood back in that time was that, that technology would destroy jobs. But often that is a full scale misunderstanding of what technology does. And I would submit to you that technology can actually increase the amount of labor that is and jobs that are available, for example. Right. So, and just like, so they used to, for example, like another silly example is related to this sort of, there used to be people, like the word computer comes from basically mostly women who were paid to compute the telemetry of rocket ships, let's just say, as a silly example, in the 1950s and 60s. Then they literally built a computer, which is like a little box. Well, it wasn't a little box. It was the size of like a small room that did all that stuff. And so, yes, those ladies were fired from the job as computers, but then we literally exploded it was a generational seismic shift into the working capacity of each individual. And who knows, like the amount of new jobs that was sort of created from the invention of what was a job killing machine, it is unimaginable the amount of jobs that computers have created, if that makes any sense. And so that's like the more sort of rosier picture of what AI can do. We don't know the amount of new jobs that will be created from extreme computing processing and artificial intelligence. That's if you argue that we're in artificial intelligence. Some other people would argue we're not really there yet anyways. But anyway, so that's the way I sort of think about it. I think that the truth is we don't know. I don't know, but those are different frameworks that I look at it, if that makes any sense.
All right, well, Richard, that was fascinating. We're up against time now, as I said, but I really appreciate your insights. This has been a really good kind of wide-ranging conversation about all kinds of different things. We'll post the links to your podcast as well as to your social media accounts, so that folks can. So that folks can follow you and find you and get more of your great insights on a regular basis. So thanks so much for joining me for this conversation, folks. We release these episodes every 2 weeks, so be back with another conversation on Resuming Debate in 14 days.